She didn't come to Blackbriar looking for love. She came looking for survival, and she walked straight up to the most dangerous man in Wyoming to get it. A widow with 2 kids, no money, and no options. A rancher who hadn't let anyone past his front gate in 3 years. And a deal so bold it made the whole town hold its breath. Most women in her situation would have begged. Lenore Ashby made an offer. What happened next changed everything. For the ranch, for the town, and for 2 people who had both stopped believing that anything could. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. The wagon rolled into Blackbriar on a Tuesday, which most of the town would later agree was the worst possible day for anything to happen. Tuesdays in Blackbriar were slow. The general store got its flour delivery. Old Pete McCready swept his porch whether it needed sweeping or not, and the women gathered at Ruth Hollenbach's kitchen table to drink weak coffee and talk about everyone who wasn't in the room. Nothing of consequence ever happened on a Tuesday, which is exactly why no one was prepared for Lenore Ashby. She came in on a borrowed wagon. That much was obvious from the cracked wheel rim and the mismatched harness that didn't quite fit the sway-backed mare pulling it. The wagon bed held everything the family owned, and it wasn't much. A trunk with a broken latch held shut by rope, 2 wool blankets folded so many times they'd gone thin at the creases, a cast-iron skillet, and a wooden box that the boy kept his hand on the entire time, like it might disappear if he didn't. The boy sat up front beside his mother, straight-backed and tight-jawed, trying to look older than 15. He did a fair job of it, mostly because of the eyes, dark and watchful, the kind of eyes that had already learned to measure a room before walking into it. Behind him in the wagon bed, a small girl of about 8 sat wrapped in a quilt, watching the town go by with the particular seriousness of a child who has learned that new places don't always mean better places. The woman driving, Lenore Ashby herself, was 34 years old, though she looked like someone had taken 34 hard years and compressed them into a face that was still, somehow, striking. Not soft. Striking. Strong jaw, dark circles she didn't bother trying to hide, hands on the reins that were cracked at the knuckles from cold and work. She wore a coat that had been decent once, maybe 5 winters ago. She wore it like it was still decent. She didn't look around at the town the way most newcomers did, taking it in, sizing it up, hoping it would be friendlier than the last place. She looked at it the way a person looks at a problem they've already decided to solve. Ruth Hollenbach saw them first from her kitchen window. She set down her coffee cup and said, "Who in the world is that?" The 3 other women at the table came to the window. "Lord," said Dora Finch, pressing her nose against the glass, "they look poor as church mice." "Don't be uncharitable," said Ruth, though her voice didn't carry much conviction. She watched the wagon move slowly down the main road. "I wonder where they're headed." That question was answered almost immediately, and not in the way any of them expected. The wagon didn't stop at the church, where families in desperate circumstances usually went first. It didn't stop at the general store. It went straight through town, slow and purposeful, past every welcoming face and curious stare. And then it kept going, northeast, on the old track road that led out of town toward the wide, flat prairie, toward the Cross Ranch. Ruth Hollenbach picked up her coffee cup, found it had gone cold, and set it back down. "Well," she said, in a tone that contained a great deal. "Well." The Cross Ranch sat 4 miles northeast of Blackbriar, behind a fence line that stretched as far as the eye could follow, and probably further. Anyone who had grown up in the area could tell you exactly where the property began, because the fence posts changed, from the weathered gray of neighboring spreads to something newer, straighter, maintained with the kind of precision that announced quietly but firmly that this land belonged to someone who took it seriously. Gideon Cross was 38 years old and had owned the ranch outright since he was 26, when his father died and left him approximately 400 acres of debt and possibility. He'd turned the debt into profit inside of 3 years and expanded twice since then. He ran 600 head of cattle across the northern range, employed 8 ranch hands during peak season and 3 year-round, and had not, by most accounts, sat down to share a meal with a neighbor in longer than anyone could clearly remember. He wasn't unfriendly exactly, he just wasn't warm. There was a difference, and people in small towns learned to feel it. He had been married once to a woman named Clara, who came from the eastern part of the state and found the winters lonely and the work unrelenting, and eventually found a different life without him. That was 5 years ago. Some people said he'd never recovered. Other people, the ones who'd known him before Clara, said he wasn't that different, that the ranch had always mattered more to him than anything else. And Clara had simply been the first to say it out loud. He was standing at the fence near the barn when the wagon appeared on the track road, which surprised him because almost no one used that road anymore. He had a length of wire in one hand and a fence plier in the other, and he watched the wagon come toward him with the expression of a man calculating whether he'd need to be rude or whether the visitors would read his posture clearly enough to turn around on their own. They did not turn around. The wagon pulled up about 15 feet from the fence and stopped. The boy hopped down before it had quite finished moving and went to hold the mare's head, a habit so automatic it seemed like something he'd done 1,000 times. The woman set the brake herself and climbed down without waiting for help. Gideon did not move. She walked to the fence and stopped on her side of it. Up close, he could see that she'd been on the road for some time. The dust on her coat said 2, maybe 3 days of hard travel. Her boots needed resoling, but she met his eyes and didn't look away. And the first thing she said wasn't a greeting or an apology or a preamble. "I'm told you're looking for a cook and housekeeper for the winter months," she said. "I heard it in Pharaoh's Crossing from a man named Delham who said your last one quit in October." Gideon looked at her. "She did. I can cook. I can clean. I can mend clothes, preserve food, manage a household budget, and I can read well enough to keep records if you need it." She paused. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work. For the 3 of us." She tilted her head toward the wagon, toward the boy, and the small face now peering over the sideboards. "To have a place to be for the winter, in exchange for honest labor." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the prairie and pushed at the collar of his coat. "That's a forward way of introducing yourself," he said. "I don't have the luxury of being indirect," she said. "I have $11, 2 children, and about 2 weeks before the serious cold comes in. My name is Lenora Ashby. My husband died 8 months ago in an accident at a lumber camp outside of Cheyenne. I've been trying to find a stable situation since March." 8 months. "Yes, and you haven't found one." Something shifted in her face, not embarrassment, more like the kind of tired honesty that stops bothering with appearances. "The places that were willing to take us in wanted things I wasn't willing to give. The places that were decent had no room, and the places that might have worked—" She stopped, restarted. "It's been a complicated 8 months." Gideon looked past her at the boy, who was still holding the mare's head and watching him with those careful dark eyes. Then at the little girl, who had apparently decided that watching was no longer sufficient and had climbed over the sideboard and was now standing in the wagon bed with her arms crossed, studying him seriously. "How old are they?" he asked. "Elias is 15. Maggie is 8. The boy ever work cattle? He worked a farm for 2 seasons in Nebraska. He's strong, and he learns fast." She hesitated, then added, in a voice that cost her something, "He's a better worker than most grown men I've seen, and I'm not just saying that because he's mine." Gideon was quiet again. A hawk moved somewhere high above them, invisible against the white winter sky. He could hear his own heartbeat, which annoyed him. "The hand who quit," he said finally. "She left because the house was too isolated, too quiet." Lenora's expression didn't change. "I've been living out of a wagon for 8 months, she said. "Quiet sounds like heaven." That, of all things, was what made him open the gate. His 3 year-round ranch hands, Tom Bridle, a weathered man of 50 who communicated mostly in grunts, Carl Jessup, younger and talkative in exact inverse proportion to Tom, and a wiry, sun-darkened man everyone called Hatch, whose real name nobody could consistently remember, all found reasons to be near the barnyard when the wagon came through the gate. They watched Gideon show the family to the main house with the focused attention of men who didn't have enough new things to look at. "She's bold," Carl said. Said Tom. "Boss hasn't had anyone in that house in, 2 years?" "3, said Hatch. Carl let out a low whistle. 3 years. Think it'll stick?" Tom turned back toward the barn. "None of our business." "Sure," said Carl. "Sure it isn't. I'll try that." The house was bigger than Lenora had expected and colder than it should have been, which told her immediately that it had been occupied by a man who didn't bother with comfort. The kitchen was functional but cheerless. The hearth in the main room was clean, He kept it clean, at least. But the windows were bare and the floors were swept without any of the small acts that turn a room into somewhere a person actually lives. There were no curtains. No rug in front of the fire. The single shelf above the mantel held a clock and nothing else. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned a slow circle while Gideon stood in the doorway, and Maggie pressed close to her side. "It needs some things," Lenora said carefully. "It has a roof," Gideon said. "It does. And a working stove." "Yes." He seemed to feel that he'd made his point. Lenora decided not to argue it. He showed them to the rooms they'd use, a small bedroom for her and Maggie, a space off the back hallway that had probably been a storage room and was just large enough for a cot, which Elias looked at with the stoic acceptance of someone who'd been sleeping in a wagon for months. There was a washroom with a pump that only worked reliably, Gideon informed them, if you primed it for a full minute before expecting water. "I'll fix it tomorrow," Elias said. Gideon looked at him. "You know how?" "I can figure it out." Something passed across Gideon's face. Not quite approval, but something adjacent to it. "Kitchen pump needs new seals too," he said, "if you're going to figure things out." Elias nodded. "I'll look at both." Gideon left them to settle in. Lenora waited until she heard his boots on the steps outside, then sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and breathed. Just breathed. Maggie climbed up beside her. "Is it okay, Mama?" she asked, in the small voice she used when she was asking a bigger question than the words themselves carried. Lenora looked at the bare window, at the cold light coming through the glass, at the cracked plaster above the doorframe that would let the cold in come January. "It's okay," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her a little. She made dinner that first night from what she found in the kitchen. Dried beans she soaked quickly, salt pork, cornbread from scratch, and a pot of something that wasn't quite stew but was hot and filling, which is what mattered. She cooked like a woman who had made do with limited supplies so many times that she no longer wasted a moment of energy grieving what she didn't have. Every motion was efficient. Nothing was wasted. Gideon came in at 6 o'clock, washed his hands at the kitchen pump, which was now working smoothly, he noticed, and sat down at the head of the table. He looked at the food, then at her, then at the two children seated across from him. Maggie was watching him with large brown eyes over the top of her water glass. "You going to stare at me all through dinner?" he asked her. Not unkindly, but directly. Maggie considered this. "Maybe," she said. A sound came out of Gideon that it took everyone a moment to identify as something close to a laugh. It startled him as much as anyone else. Dinner passed mostly in silence, Gideon's preferred kind, but it was different from the silence an empty house makes. It was a silence with breathing in it, with the sound of someone small shifting in a chair, with the scrape of a spoon that needed to reach the last bit at the bottom of the bowl. When they were done, Lenora cleared the table without being asked. Elias carried the dishes. Maggie sat by the fire and fell asleep in the chair without meaning to, her head tipping sideways by degrees until it was resting against the armrest. Gideon sat at the table a while longer than he needed to. He looked at the sleeping child, at the fire, which was burning better than it usually did because Elias had fixed the draft on the flue. He'd noticed that too. At the kitchen, where Lenora moved with quiet efficiency and didn't chat at him or ask unnecessary questions. He had expected, when he'd agreed to this, and he was still not entirely clear on why he'd agreed to this, to feel invaded, to feel the walls of his carefully maintained solitude pressed on and thinned. He felt something else instead. He couldn't name it. He didn't try. He pushed back from the table and said, "The north fence needs checking in the morning before the temperature drops. If the boy wants to come, he can." Lenora, from the kitchen, "He'll be up at 5. I leave at 5:30. He'll be ready." Gideon picked up his coat from the hook by the door. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at the room, the fire, the sleeping girl, the sound of water being wrung from a rag in the kitchen. Then he went out. The town found out within 48 hours, because towns always do. Ruth Hollenbach heard it from Carl Jessup's wife, who had heard it from Carl, who had told her with the enthusiasm of a man who had been sitting on news for almost 2 full days. By Thursday morning, it had made its way through the better part of Blackbriar, and by Thursday afternoon it had already begun to change shape in the retelling. "She just walked right up to his fence," said Dora Finch. "Bold as brass," agreed someone. "Well, it won't last," said another voice from around Ruth's kitchen table. "You know how he is. He'll tire of the inconvenience inside a week and send them packing." "I don't know," said Ruth carefully. "Carl said the boy fixed 2 pumps the first evening." "What's that got to do with anything?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She thought about the woman she'd watched drive through town, straight-backed, not looking around, not performing anything for anyone, like someone who had run completely out of the energy it takes to pretend things are other than they are. "I just think," she said slowly, "we ought to wait and see." Nobody around the table agreed with her, but she didn't need them to. On the 5th morning, Gideon came in from the barn to find Lenora on a ladder, an actual ladder, pulled from the barn and leaned against the kitchen wall, hanging something in the window. He stopped in the doorway. "What is that?" he said. "Curtain." She didn't look down. She was tying it off on a nail she'd evidently already put in. "I found the fabric in the trunk in the back bedroom. It was just sitting there." "That was Clara's," he said. Lenora stopped, looked down at him, held the look for a moment. "I'll take it down," she said. He was quiet for a beat too long. "Leave it," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He turned and went back outside without having gotten whatever he'd come in for. He stood in the cold for a minute, in the flat winter light, with the wind pressing at him from the north. The curtain was yellow, old and a little faded, but yellow. He didn't know when he'd last had a color in that kitchen. He picked up his tools and went back to work. And he didn't let himself think about it, which meant he thought about it for most of the rest of the day. 3 weeks in, it began to snow. It started gently, the way the worst storms sometimes start. A few flakes, harmless, almost peaceful, drifting down from a sky that looked more gray than threatening. By nightfall, it was laying 2 inches an hour, and the temperature had dropped to a place where the air felt less like weather and more like something with intention. The ranch hands came in early. Even Tom Bridle, who had a rule about never letting the weather make decisions for him, came in at 3 in the afternoon instead of 4. Elias was the last one in from the north pasture, and he came in with ice on his eyelashes and a rope burn on his right hand from where he'd had to pull a stuck calf out of a drift one-handed while holding a fence post with the other. And when he came through the back door, Lenora looked at the hand and closed her eyes for 1 second before she opened them again and went to get the salve. "I'm fine," he said. "I know you are." She took his hand and started working on it. "Hold still. It doesn't hurt much. That's because your hands are frozen. It'll hurt later." Gideon watched this from the corner of the kitchen where he was pouring coffee, and he thought about all the ways 15 years old was still very young, and all the ways this particular 15-year-old had already grown past it. The rope burn was the kind of thing that happened when you made a judgment call in difficult conditions, and the judgment was sound, but the conditions were worse than anticipated. He had done exactly the same thing at 15 on this same ranch, and his own mother had done exactly what Lenora was doing now, said nothing about the danger, treated the wound without drama, let the doing of the practical thing stand in for everything emotional that couldn't be said. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table in front of the stool where Elias was sitting. The boy looked at it, then at Gideon. Gideon said nothing. He just picked up his own cup and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the snow. After a moment, Elias picked up the second cup. He didn't say anything either. Lenora looked between them, and she thought, there it is. That invisible thing that happens between men sometimes. The acknowledgement that passes without words, that means more because of what it doesn't say. She wrapped the hand and didn't comment on it. The snow fell all night, and all the next day, and all through the night following that. The ranch held. The animals were sheltered. The fences were sound. And in the mornings, when the light came in through the yellow curtain and landed on the kitchen table where they all sat with their coffee and their silence and their various hurts and habits, the house felt not quite like a home yet, but warmer than it had been. And that, for now, was enough. The yellow curtain became the first thing people noticed when they came to the Cross Ranch, which almost nobody did, but the few who had reason to, Hatch dropping off feed receipts, the veterinarian making his winter rounds, the supply man from Pharaoh's Crossing who came once a month regardless of weather because Gideon paid on time, and that bought a lot of loyalty. They all noticed it. A small thing, a domestic thing, the kind of detail that wouldn't mean anything in a house where such things were ordinary. But on the Cross Ranch, where every window had been bare for 3 years running, a yellow curtain in the kitchen window was the kind of thing a person carried back to town and mentioned, almost without meaning to, the way you mention something that doesn't quite fit the picture you had in your head. Ruth Hollenbach heard about the curtain from the supply man. She sat with it for a moment, then poured herself more coffee and decided she didn't know what to make of it, which was an unusual position for her to be in. What she did know, what most of Blackbriar was beginning to piece together from the various fragments coming back through various channels, was that the arrangement at the Cross Ranch had not collapsed inside the first week the way everyone had assumed it would. 5 weeks had passed. The widow was still there. The children were still there. And Gideon Cross, by all accounts, had not run anyone off his property. This was, by Blackbriar standards, extraordinary. It was also, by Blackbriar standards, suspicious. The talk shifted somewhere around the 5th week, the way talk in small towns always shifts when the first theory fails to prove out. It moved from, she won't last, to something with sharper edges. What does she want from him? The question traveled fast once it started, picking up weight as it went. Someone mentioned that the Cross Ranch was worth considerable money now, the land alone, plus the cattle, plus the improvements Gideon had put into the North Range over the past decade. Someone else pointed out that a widow with nothing had every reason to position herself close to a man with a great deal. A third voice added, with the precision of someone delivering a verdict they'd already reached, that a woman bold enough to walk up to a man's fence and propose a living arrangement had probably been planning more than honest work from the very beginning. By the time these ideas reached Ruth Hollenbach's kitchen table, they had the firm, settled shape of things people believe, not because they have evidence, but because the believing satisfies something. Ruth listened. She didn't argue. She had learned at 61 that arguing with a table full of women who have already made up their minds is a waste of coffee. But she thought about the curtain, and she thought about what the supply man had also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the kitchen smelled like food when he came through, and that a boy had come out to help him unload the wagon without being asked, and that the boy had said "thank you, sir," when he left, which the supply man had noted because it was the kind of politeness that surprised you when you weren't expecting it. She thought, there is more than one way to read a situation. She kept that thought to herself. Inside the ranch, none of this talk had arrived yet. Not directly, anyway. But Lenora could feel the shape of it. She had lived enough places in the past 8 months to develop a sensitivity to the particular quality of silence that meant people were forming opinions about you. She felt it at the general store when she came in with Gideon's supply list. She felt it in the way the woman behind the counter was careful to be polite, careful the way people are careful when they're working to conceal something. She felt it in the half-second pause before people greeted her. She didn't say anything about it to Gideon. It wasn't his problem to manage, and she had not come here to create problems. What she did instead was work. She worked with the same focused efficiency she'd brought to that first dinner, but expanded now across the whole of the house and into the rhythms of the ranch itself. She learned where things were kept and why. She learned which of the ranch hands liked their coffee strong, and which one, Carl, had a habit of leaving his gloves on the kitchen windowsill and forgetting them and coming back for them, which she'd solved by simply moving his gloves to the hook by the back door where he couldn't miss them. Carl had noticed after the third time and said, with some embarrassment, "Ma'am, you didn't have to," and she'd cut him off with, "I know I didn't," and gone back to what she was doing, and Carl had stood there for a moment with an expression that suggested no one had ever done something considerate for him without requiring acknowledgement, and then he'd taken his gloves and gone. She fixed the cracked plaster above the back door with a mixture she learned from a book she found in the bedroom trunk. Claire's trunk, she'd realized, which she'd handled with care and which she'd asked Gideon about before touching anything further. He'd gone still when she mentioned it, the way he went still about certain things, and then said, "Take what's useful. The rest can stay where it is." So she had respectfully, and the plaster above the door was now sealed against the cold, which anyone who'd spent a winter in Wyoming could tell you mattered more than it looked like it would. She kept the kitchen warm. She kept the accounts Gideon asked her to keep, and she found 2 billing errors in the records that dated back 8 months, which she corrected and flagged without commentary. He found the corrected ledger on his desk one morning, the errors marked neatly in pencil with the corrections beside them, and he sat down and looked at it for a long moment, and then came to the kitchen doorway. You found these yourself? He said. The numbers didn't balance, she said. She was kneading bread dough and didn't look up. The man I hired before Clara, he kept those books for 4 years. He was transposing figures on the supply invoices. It's a common mistake. Gideon was quiet. I wasn't looking to criticize, she added. I just thought you'd want to know. I do want to know, he said. He paused. Thank you. She nodded at the dough. He went back to his desk. It was the first time he'd thanked her for something, and she recognized it for what it was. Not a small thing for a man who found most words difficult. She didn't make anything of it, but she remembered it. Elias, meanwhile, was becoming something that even Gideon had not quite anticipated. The boy had come to the ranch with solid instincts and a willingness to work that was immediately evident to anyone who spent 5 minutes watching him. But willingness to work and actual competence are different things, and competence on a cattle ranch in winter required specific knowledge that a 15-year-old farm boy from Nebraska shouldn't have had yet. What became clear over the first month was that Elias had a quality that was harder to teach than technique. He watched. He watched everything. He watched the way Gideon read the sky before deciding whether to move the cattle. He watched the way Tom Bridle checked a fence post for subsidence before deciding whether to replace it outright or brace it. He watched Hatch's hands when Hatch was treating a sick animal, the particular stillness, the pressure, the patience of it. And then he did those things himself the next time he had occasion to, not perfectly, but not badly either. Tom Bridle, who had not changed his assessment of any human being since approximately 1887, told Carl one evening that the boy had good hands. Carl received this information with appropriate gravity, knowing that Tom issuing a compliment was like a winter thaw, rare, significant, and worth noting. Gideon said nothing directly to Elias for most of the first month. He directed him through the work, corrected him when correction was needed, and let the silence between corrections speak for itself. But there was a moment, near the end of the 5th week, that Elias would not forget. They'd been moving part of the herd from the east pasture to closer range, anticipating the next cold snap, and one of the cows, a cantankerous older animal that Tom had privately labeled a menace to organized society, had broken from the group and headed for the tree line at the north end of the property. Gideon had gone left to circle her back, which was the logical move, the move any experienced hand would make. Elias had gone right, which made no immediate sense, until it became clear 30 seconds later that he'd anticipated where the cow would break when she hit the tree line and was already there to turn her, and the animal came back into the group without further argument. Gideon pulled up alongside him after. Elias was breathing hard. His horse was blowing steam in the cold air. "How'd you know she'd break right?" Gideon asked. "Her left front leg," Elias said. "She's favoring it a little. Has been for 2 days. She wasn't going to push hard on that side when she hit the trees." Gideon looked at him. Then he looked out over the herd, his jaw working slightly, the way it did when he was thinking something he hadn't decided yet whether to say. "Tell Tom when we get in," he said finally. "He'll look at the leg." "Yes, sir." They rode back in silence, but it was a different kind of silence from the one that had existed between them 5 weeks ago. There was less distance in it. Maggie, who everyone had been treating as a small and somewhat peripheral figure in all of this, the child who needed to be housed and fed and kept warm, was doing something that nobody was tracking carefully enough to notice until it was well underway. She was making herself at home. Not in a demanding way. Not in the way of a child who announces her presence and requires attention. She did it quietly, incrementally, in the manner of someone who has learned that overt need sometimes closes doors. She found the cat that lived in the barn, a gray torn of advanced age and profound indifference to human beings, and made it her project to win his trust, which she accomplished over 2 weeks through the systematic application of patience and small pieces of dried beef. Once the cat had accepted her, she could often be found in the corner of the kitchen with him in her lap, doing nothing in particular, just being present. The cat, who had a name nobody remembered, she rechristened Miller, for reasons she never explained. She asked Gideon questions. Not constantly. She was too perceptive for that. She'd learned to read his face well enough to know when questions were welcome and when they weren't. But in the quiet moments after dinner, when he stayed at the table longer than necessary with his coffee, she sometimes came to sit across from him, and the questions she asked were not child's questions. They were the questions of someone genuinely curious about the world she'd landed in. "Why do the cattle stay together when it's cold?" she asked him one evening. "Warmth," he said. "Body heat. They know without being taught that being close is safer." She considered this. "Do people do that too?" He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Sometimes," he said. "We didn't used to," she said, in a matter-of-fact tone that landed like something much heavier. "It was just us three for a long time. On the road." She pulled Miller closer. "It's better here." Gideon said nothing. He looked at the fire for a while. "Yes," he said finally. "It is." It was the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in a long time, and the fact that he'd said it to an 8-year-old with a barn cat in her lap was the kind of thing that could either make a person feel ridiculous or could make them feel, quietly and with some surprise, like something inside them was still capable of being simple. He chose that night not to examine it too closely. He just let it sit. Then the town came to him. It wasn't a delegation exactly, nothing that formal. It was Vernon Crail, who ran the largest competing spread to the south, and who had been a neighbor to Gideon for 15 years in the way that some men are neighbors, present, civil, and never quite friends. Vernon was in his mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, with a white mustache he maintained with more care than he'd ever given his 2 marriages. He came on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, which was how Vernon did everything. Gideon met him in the yard. "Just a social call," Vernon said, which both of them knew was not true. They went inside, which Gideon would not have done under ordinary circumstances, but Lenora had gone to town with Elias for supplies, and Maggie was at the barn with the cat, so the house was empty. He put coffee on, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Vernon looked around the room with the careful eyes of a man cataloging what he sees for a later conversation. "Place looks different," Vernon said. "Things get fixed," Gideon said. "What do you want, Vernon?" Vernon turned his coffee cup in his hands. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say and is not sure the rehearsal was adequate. "There's talk," he said. "There's always talk." "This is specific talk." Vernon looked at him. "About the woman." Gideon waited. "People are saying she's got designs on this place," Vernon said. "On the ranch, that she's positioning herself." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who knows he's on uncertain ground. "Strategically. People say a lot of things." "Gideon," Vernon leaned forward slightly, "I'm not here to stick my nose in your personal business. I'm here as someone who has known you since you were 22 years old, and I'm asking you, man to man, do you know what you're doing?" The kitchen was quiet. The fire ticked in the hearth. "I know she fixed 2 billing errors in my ledger that my previous bookkeeper missed for 8 months, Gideon said. "I know her son observed a lame cow before any of my experienced hands did. I know my house is warm and the food is cooked and the accounts are in order." He looked at Vernon steadily. "What would you like me to do differently?" Vernon sat back. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm just telling you what people are saying." "I know what people are saying. I heard it the last time I was in town." A pause. "What you're saying, Vernon, that's a different question." Vernon had the decency to look uncomfortable. He picked up his coffee and drank some of it and set it down. "All I'm saying," he said, "is be careful. I'll take that under consideration." Vernon left 20 minutes later. Gideon stayed at the table after he heard the hoofbeats fade, looking at the yellow curtain in the window, which was moving slightly in the draft from somewhere in the wall he hadn't found yet. He thought about what Vernon had said. He turned it over, examined it, looked for the parts of it that were true, and the parts that were something else. What he came back to every time was simpler than the accusation. He had watched Lenore Ashby work in this house for 5 weeks. He had watched her fix things without being asked and correct his records without credit and cook 3 meals a day, and never once, not once, had she said or done anything that suggested she was calculating anything beyond the next task that needed doing. He had known people who wanted things from him. Clara had wanted things from him. Vernon Crail had wanted things from him. He had a fairly well-developed sense of what that looked like. Lenora Ashby wanted to feed her children and get through the winter. He understood that with the same certainty, he understood weather or fences or the shifting behavior of a herd under stress, from long observation, from evidence, from the pattern of small things adding up to something unmistakable. When she came back from town that afternoon with Elias, He was back out at the fence line, and he didn't mention Vernon's visit. He didn't mention it that evening at dinner or the day after. What he did do, the following week, was go into town himself for the first time in nearly a month. And when he came back, he had 3 things in the wagon that he set on the kitchen table without explanation: a bolt of wool fabric in dark blue, a sewing kit, and a pair of good winter boots in approximately Lenora's size. He went back outside before she could say anything. She stood in the kitchen looking at the boots for a long moment. Her old ones were being held together partly by habit and partly by Elias, who had sewn the left sole back twice already. She already knew that, and she knew that he knew that, because there was nothing on a ranch that Gideon Cross didn't notice. She sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the worn wood surface and just sat there for a minute, not quite knowing what to do with the feeling that was moving through her. Something between gratitude and something older and more complicated, the feeling of being seen when you'd gotten used to going unseen. When Elias came in 20 minutes later and saw the boots, he looked at them and then at his mother's face. "He brought those back?" he asked. "Yes." Elias was quiet for a moment. He was 15 and he'd watched his mother hold everything together for 8 months with almost nothing, and there were things he'd learned to carry quietly because she was already carrying too much. He looked at the boots and he looked at his mother and he said simply, "Good." And then he went to wash up for dinner. That evening, Gideon came in to find Lenora already at the stove and Maggie at the table with a piece of paper, drawing something with a stub of pencil. He sat down in his usual chair. The kitchen smelled like onions and salt pork and the particular warmth of a room that has been inhabited well. "Thank you," Lenora said from the stove. She didn't turn around. "For the boots." "The old ones weren't going to last the winter," he said. "No," she agreed. "They weren't." There was a pause. "The blue wool," she said. "That was more than was necessary." "The windows in the back bedroom let the cold in," he said. "Curtains would help?" She turned at that and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was careful and complicated and very human. A woman who had learned to be suspicious of generosity because generosity had come with conditions before. He could see her working through it, deciding what to do with what she was feeling. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he said. Maggie looked up from her drawing. "I drew Miller," she announced, and held up the paper, which did in fact look something like a cat, if you allowed for the artistic limitations of an 8-year-old with a stub pencil. Gideon looked at it. "That's a fine-looking animal," he said. "He looks fatter in real life," Maggie said seriously. "I didn't have enough paper for all of him." And there it was again, that sound from Gideon that was nearly a laugh. Less startling than the first time, but still something that didn't quite fit the version of him the town had assembled from second-hand accounts. Outside, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees overnight, and the snow that had been holding off for 2 days began to fall again, steady and quiet, covering the fence lines and the bare pasture and the track road back to town. Inside the ranch house, the fire burned on. The curtain moved in its draft. And somewhere under all the work and the wariness and the careful distance everyone was still keeping from everyone else, something was beginning to change that none of them had a name for yet, and that none of them, least of all Gideon, was ready to look at directly. The winter was not even half over. There was a great deal still to come, but for this one quiet evening, with snow on the roof and food on the table and a child holding up a drawing of a fat cat, the ranch felt like something other than a fortress. It felt, in the most careful and provisional of ways, like a place where people lived. The blue wool curtains went up in the back bedroom on a Saturday, which Lenora noted only because Saturdays had started to feel different from the other days on the ranch. Slightly slower in the morning, slightly louder at dinner, because Carl Jessup considered Saturday evenings a legitimate occasion for conversation, and nobody had yet found a way to discourage him that he actually respected. She'd sewn them in the evenings over the course of a week, after dinner, at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close. Her stitching was not beautiful, she'd never claimed to be a seamstress, but it was straight and it would hold, and when she hung them and stepped back and looked at the window, they did what they were supposed to do. They kept the cold out. They also made the room look like a place where someone had decided to stay, which was a different thing than she'd been telling herself this arrangement was, and she noticed that and didn't follow the thought any further. Gideon saw them when he came through the back hall that afternoon. He stopped, looked, said nothing, moved on. That was she had learned the equivalent of a compliment. December deepened. The cold that had been arriving in installments since November finally committed itself fully to the landscape and didn't let up. The temperature on some mornings hit 20 below before the sun was fully up, and the work of keeping the ranch operational in those conditions was relentless and physical and occasionally brutal. Ice formed on the water troughs overnight and had to be broken before the cattle could drink. Hay had to be moved from the northern storage barn to the feeding areas twice daily. Equipment that sat idle for more than a few hours in that cold needed coaxing back to function. The horses required extra feed and extra attention, and the older ones required a kind of vigilance that didn't leave much room in a day for anything else. Elias worked in all of it. He was up before 5 every morning now, not because anyone had told him to be, but because he'd learned, in the way that capable young men learn things, that being ahead of the problem was better than catching up to it. He ate fast, dressed in the layered system that Tom Bridle had shown him, 3 layers on top, wool sock liners inside the boots, the bandana over the lower half of his face that kept frostbite from the ears and nose. And he was out in the dark with a lantern before the ranch hands sometimes, which had initially irritated Carl and eventually earned a kind of quiet, unspoken respect from all 3 of them. His rope burn had healed. He had 2 new ones, on the other hand, from a bad morning with the hay bales when the wind had taken the line sideways, and his grip had to make up the difference. He didn't mention these to his mother. He mentioned them to nobody. He treated them himself with the salve she kept on the shelf and wrapped them and went back to work. He was not trying to prove anything, or if he was, he didn't think of it in those terms. He was trying to be worth the arrangement. He understood, with the practical intelligence of a boy who'd been watching his family's circumstances carefully for 8 months, that their position here was not guaranteed, that it rested on a man's judgment that could change, that the best insurance he had was being genuinely useful, not performatively useful. The difference mattered, and he was old enough to know it. What he had not anticipated was that something else was being built alongside the practical thing. Not a transaction, something harder to name. It happened on a Wednesday morning when the temperature had dropped to 23 below, and the main water line to the horse barn froze solid, despite the insulation they'd wrapped it with in November. Gideon discovered it at 5:40 in the morning, and his language upon discovering it was specific and heartfelt. Tom and Hatch were working the line from the outside. Gideon was under the barn in the crawl space with a heat lamp and approximately 14 inches of clearance, and Elias was the only one small enough to fit in beside him. They were in there for an hour and 40 minutes. It was dark, and it smelled like cold earth and old manure, and the heat lamp made a sound like a wasp in a jar. They worked in shifts, one holding the lamp while the other worked the pipe joints, trading off when arms got tired. Gideon's knees were bad in the cold. Elias had noticed this, the way he moved in the first hour of cold mornings. And in the crawl space, there was no position that didn't make it worse. And after a while, he just stopped trying to shift and absorbed it. "How much further?" Elias asked at one point, his voice flat against the dirt floor. 6 inches, Gideon said. "Maybe 8. The joint looks corroded." "I know it does. Watch your fingers near that lamp." Elias moved his fingers. They worked. The pipe yielded eventually, the way stuck things yield when you apply enough heat and patience and controlled force. And when they heard water moving again through the line, Gideon put his head down on his forearm for a moment in the way a man does when something he was holding inside releases. They got out from under the barn in stages, Elias first, then Gideon, who came out with a sound that was not quite a groan but was in the neighborhood. He straightened up slowly. His knees were visible in how he stood. "You should wrap those," Elias said before he thought about whether it was his place to say. Gideon looked at him. "In the cold," Elias said. "My father's back." He stopped, restarted. "There's a way of wrapping that helps, with the wool. I can show you if you want." The silence went a beat too long. Elias started to walk it back. "You don't have to." "All right," Gideon said. They went inside. Lenora was at the stove. She took one look at both of them, the dirt, the stiffness in Gideon's posture, her son's red rawness from the cold, and went to the cabinet without a word. Elias took the wool wrapping she brought and showed Gideon, matter-of-factly, without theater, the method he'd learned watching his father through 2 bad winters. Gideon sat in the kitchen chair and let him, which was its own thing. Lenora put food on the table and did not comment on any of it. At the end of it, Gideon flexed his knee experimentally. Something in his face changed. "Your father taught you that?" he asked. "Yes, sir." A beat. "He was a practical man." "He was," Elias said. There was a careful steadiness in his voice, the kind that a person builds over time, over something that still hurts. "He was good at fixing things." Gideon nodded. He picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything more about it, but he didn't need to. Elias understood what the silence carried. The talk from town arrived at the ranch directly on the first Friday of December, which was when Dora Finch came out in her husband's wagon on what she described as a welfare visit, checking on the Ashby children, making sure they were fed and warm, which fooled exactly nobody, including Lenora, who opened the door and let her in because turning her away would only make things worse. Dora was 50, narrow-faced, and possessed of the particular energy of a woman who experiences other people's business as a personal responsibility. She came in and looked around the kitchen with eyes that moved fast and cataloged everything. The blue curtains visible in the back hall, the organized shelves, the pot on the stove, the ledger book open on the side table, and her expression went through several adjustments before settling on something that was trying to be pleasant. "It's very—" She paused. "Homey," she said. "We've been working on it," Lenora said. She poured coffee without being asked, because it was the thing you did and because having something to do with her hands helped. Maggie was at the table with Miller and her drawing materials. She looked at Dora with the frank assessment of a child who has learned to take the measure of adults quickly. Miller looked at Dora with the absolute indifference of a barn cat who has never cared about anyone's opinion. "The children look well," Dora said, which was not really what she'd come to establish. "They are," Lenora said. A pause. Dora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You know," she said, in the tone of someone approaching the thing they actually came to say, "people in town worry about Mr. Cross. He's had a difficult few years. People care about him. That's kind of them. And some people wonder," another pause, "whether this arrangement is really what's best for him in the long term." Lenora set her own cup down. She looked at Dora Finch directly, with the same level gaze she'd used at the fence the day she'd arrived. "Mrs. Finch," she said, "I clean his house, cook his meals, and keep his accounts. My son works his cattle. In exchange, we have a roof and food for the winter. There is nothing in that arrangement that harms anyone." She stopped. "If you have something more specific to say, I'd rather you said it." Dora blinked. She had not expected directness. People rarely did, coming in expecting guilt. "I just think," Dora said, recovering, "that a man in his position, with what he has, should be careful about people who arrive unexpectedly and—" "Mrs. Finch?" Lenora's voice was still even, but there was something under it now. "My husband died in March. I have been keeping my children fed since then without help from this town or any other. I did not arrive here to take anything from Gideon Cross. I came to work for what I needed." She picked up her cup again. "I understand that's hard to believe. I don't know that there's anything I can do about that." The kitchen was very quiet. Even Maggie had stopped drawing. Dora Finch opened her mouth, closed it, and looked into her coffee. "The curtains are pretty," she said finally. It was the best she could manage. "Thank you," Lenora said. "I made them from wool he brought back from town." Another pause. Something moved across Dora's face, not quite recalculation, more like the first small crack in a position she'd arrived holding firmly. She finished her coffee and left 20 minutes later. She didn't say anything more about what she'd come to say. In the wagon going back to town, she sat with what she'd seen: the clean, organized kitchen, the steady-eyed woman who hadn't flinched, the little girl with her cat and her drawings, the ledger book open on the table, and she felt, with some discomfort, that the version of events she'd come out here with did not hold up as well against the actual evidence. She didn't tell Ruth Hollenbach this right away, but she told her eventually. What she couldn't have known, what nobody in town knew yet, was that the thing they were all discussing in warm kitchens and dry general stores was about to be tested in a way that required no interpretation. It came on a Thursday night in the second week of December, and it came fast. Gideon had read the sky wrong, or rather, he'd read it right, but the storm moved faster than it had any business doing. He'd clocked the pressure drop at 3 in the afternoon and pushed the timetable for moving the northern cattle closer in, but the storm outpaced the plan. By 8 o'clock that evening, the wind was coming in at 40 miles an hour out of the northwest, and the temperature had dropped 16 degrees in 4 hours, and the northern range, where 380 head of cattle were supposed to be in the process of being moved to safer ground, was becoming a white emergency. Tom and Hatch had made it out to the north fence earlier and had not made it back. The phone line, Blackbriar had gotten a line through the previous year, one of the first in the county, was dead from the wind. The barn doors were shaking in their frames. Carl came in at 8:15, ice-crusted and barely verbal, and told Gideon what he'd seen from the eastern rise. A section of the north fence was down, probably from the weight of the ice that had been building on the wire since mid-afternoon. The cattle were moving, which in a whiteout meant they were moving wrong, away from shelter into the open range, which in these conditions was a death sentence for the herd and a financial catastrophe for the ranch. Carl was 32 years old and had worked cattle for 15 years, and he was telling Gideon this with the expression of a man who was not going back out into that storm, which was a reasonable position. Gideon stood in the kitchen with his coat already on and looked at Carl and then at the window, which showed nothing but white and black. And then, without having planned it, without having thought through what it meant, he looked at Elias. The boy was standing by the door. He had his coat on too. He'd put it on when Carl had started talking. "You don't have to go," Gideon said. "I know," Elias said. Lenora was across the kitchen. She had gone very still in the way she went still when she was working hard to keep her face from showing what was happening inside her. She looked at her son, the ice still on his collar from the evening chores, the rope-scarred hands, the 15-year-old jaw set with a seriousness that she had watched grow over 8 months of hard circumstance. And she did the calculation that no mother wants to make. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. She crossed the kitchen and she put both hands on either side of his face. This boy who was almost taller than her now. This boy who had his father's eyes and her own stubborn line of jaw. And she looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she pulled his hat down on his head more firmly, the way she had done when he was small. "You stay with him," she said. "You stay where he can see you." "Yes, ma'am." She let him go. She did not watch them leave. She stood at the kitchen table with her back to the door and her hands flat on the surface, and she listened to the wind take the sound of them away. Maggie appeared at the kitchen doorway. She had Miller in her arms, and her face held a question she didn't ask out loud. "Come here," Lenora said. Maggie came, and Lenora sat down and pulled her close, and they sat together at the kitchen table while the storm threw itself against the house. And Lenora did the only thing left to do, which was wait. Outside, the world had gone completely white. Gideon had ridden in blizzard conditions before. It was not something you survived in Wyoming without having done it. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and being inside it at 40 below wind chill with zero visibility and the sound of the storm so loud it pushed out your own thoughts. He rode by compass and by the fence line, where the fence line was still standing, and where it wasn't, he rode by the way the snow lay and the angle of the wind and 20 years of knowing this land. Elias stayed close. Gideon had told him 10 feet behind, no more. In a whiteout, you lost a man at 20 feet and you never found him. And Elias held that distance with a steadiness that required more control than it looked like, because every instinct in a bad storm said, close the gap, said push forward, said don't let the person ahead of you get swallowed by the white. They found the first cattle about 1.5 miles out, a clump of them standing with their backs to the wind in the hollow of a dry creek bed, which was both the good news and the bad news. Good because the hollow gave them some shelter. Bad because 30 head of cattle in a frozen creek bed in a blizzard were going to start losing the cold battle within a couple of hours. North, Gideon said over the wind. The rest'll be north. They run downwind. He was right. They found more cattle in a wide, staggered line extending north and west from the broken fence, moving in the terrible slow way of animals that have given themselves over to the direction of the storm. Getting them turned was the work of 2 riders in conditions that made every other time Elias had worked cattle feel like practice for this moment. They rode hard and low and used the horses the way the horses were trained to be used, cutting, pressing, shouldering animals back, using their weight and their noise and the coordination between horse and rider that only comes from enough hours of it. Elias made mistakes. He lost a group he'd been bringing back when a sudden gust disoriented his horse, and he came around too wide. He didn't say anything about it. He found the group again and brought them back around a different way and said nothing about that either. Gideon saw it. He said nothing about it either. He knew what it cost a young person to make a mistake in front of someone they were trying not to let down, and he knew that the best thing you could do for them in that moment was let the work be the work and not make more of it. They found Tom and Hatch 2 miles out on the North Range. Tom's horse had thrown a shoe, and Hatch had stayed with him rather than leave him, which was characteristic of Hatch, and which had probably kept Tom from losing the horse and possibly himself in the storm. They were on foot, leading the horse, which was moving 3-legged and miserable. "Fence is down in 4 sections," Tom said, when Gideon reached them. He had to say it with his face turned sideways to the wind to get the words out. "Running 100 head at least up toward the north draw." "I know it. Get back toward the barn. Leave the horse with Elias." Tom looked at Elias, then back at Gideon. "Boy know what he's doing?" "Boy got us this far," Gideon said. "He was already moving. What happened in the next 3 hours was not heroic in the way that stories sometimes make things heroic. It was cold and dark and miserable and specific. It was following cattle in a whiteout and losing them and finding them again. It was a rope that went wrong and caught Gideon across the left forearm, hard enough to leave a bruise he'd find 4 days later when the swelling finally told him where it was. It was Elias's horse losing footing on an ice patch on a slope and going down on one knee, and Elias staying on somehow, he was never entirely sure how, and the horse coming back up and both of them carrying on without stopping to examine what had just almost happened. It was Gideon pulling his horse up on the edge of the north draw at 2 in the morning and looking out at the scattered shapes below. The cattle, 100 and some, milling in the draw's shelter, and feeling something give way inside him that had been held tight for hours. Elias came up beside him. They looked at the cattle. The wind was still screaming, but it was slightly less in the draw. The cattle were alive, most of them. "We're going to lose 2 or 3, Gideon said. His voice was rough. "The ones that went north of the tree line. We couldn't get to them in time." Elias was quiet. "That's how it goes sometimes," Gideon said. Not harshly, not softly either, just honestly. "You do what you can do, and the rest is what it is." Elias nodded. His face was almost entirely covered, only his eyes visible between the bandana and the hat brim, but Gideon could read the nod. He'd given that same nod at 15 in a different blizzard on this same ground to his own father. "Can we get them back in tonight?" Elias asked. "Some. The rest will pen in the draw and come back at first light." Gideon turned his horse. "Come on." They worked another hour getting as many as they could moving back toward the home range. Then they rode back in the dark, following the compass, with the wind behind them now, and the snow easing, barely, but enough to feel, as the storm began to exhaust itself at the edges. They came back through the barn doors at 3:40 in the morning. Carl was there. He'd been keeping the horses up, which was the practical contribution available to him, and when he opened the barn door and saw both of them come through the white, Gideon stiff and ice-covered, Elias close behind him with Tom's limping horse on a lead, Carl had an expression that he quickly reorganized into something more composed. "How bad?" he asked. 2, maybe 3 head lost," Gideon said. "Rest are in the draw or moving home. Tom and Hatch? Inside. Tom's horse is going to need a few weeks." Gideon nodded. He unsaddled his horse with the automatic motions of a man running on the last of his resources. Elias did the same. They worked in silence because there was nothing left for words. When the horses were seen to, they went to the house. Lenora was awake. She had never not been. She was at the kitchen table with a lamp and the account book she'd been pretending to work on, and when the back door opened and they came in on a wave of cold, she stood up and the account book slid off the table and she didn't pick it up. She looked at Elias first, all of him, the way a mother does when she's doing inventory, and when she'd confirmed he was whole, she let out a breath that had apparently been held for 7 hours. Then she went to the stove and started heating what she'd had ready for them since midnight. Gideon sat down at the table heavily. Maggie's drawing of Miller was still on the corner of the table where it had been left, slightly crumpled from having been moved aside for the account book. He looked at it. 2 or 3 head, he said, to no one in particular, out of 380. Lenore set a bowl in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Eat," she said. Not gently, practically. He picked up the spoon. Elias came back from changing his outer layers and sat down, and Lenora put food in front of him too. And they ate, all three of them, in the kind of silence that isn't empty. The kind that comes after something has happened and the happening hasn't quite finished becoming a memory yet. At some point, Maggie appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently woken at the sound of people, and she took in the scene with her usual serious assessment. "You're back," she said. "We're back," Elias said. She came and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and she didn't say anything else. Gideon ate. He looked at the family across his kitchen table. The boy who had ridden into a blizzard without being asked, the girl pressed against her brother's arm. The woman who had had food ready at 4 in the morning and had not once, tonight or any other night, asked him for more than he'd agreed to give. He thought about Vernon Crail's warning. He thought about Dora Finch coming out with her careful eyes. He thought about what the town was saying about what this family wanted from him. He thought about 3 hours in a whiteout with a 15-year-old boy who kept his position, kept his nerve, and never once made the night about himself. He thought about what he wanted to say and how poorly equipped he was to say it. He settled for what he could manage. "You did well tonight," he said to Elias. "In the draw. You did well." Elias looked at the table. His jaw moved slightly. He nodded once. Lenora didn't look at either of them. She refilled her own coffee cup, and her hands were steady, and she didn't let the thing showing in her eyes become anything that anyone was required to respond to. Outside, the blizzard finished its business with Blackbriar and moved east. It left behind a landscape so altered, so white and still and vast under the clearing sky, that it looked like the beginning of something, like land that had been cleared and left ready for whatever would be built on it next. Inside the ranch house, the lamp burned on. The fire held. The kitchen table held 4 people who had no name yet for what they were to each other. But after tonight, they all knew it was something. The news of what had happened on the Cross Ranch that Thursday night reached Blackbriar by Friday afternoon, carried in pieces by different people who had different portions of it. Carl Jessup told his wife, who told Ruth Hollenbach. The veterinarian who came out Saturday morning to look at Tom Bridle's horse came back to town and told the man at the feed store. The feed store man told everyone else. What the town received, assembled from all these fragments, was this. A blizzard had hit the North Range and scattered the better part of the cross herd into a whiteout, and Gideon had ridden out into it at 8 in the evening and not come back until nearly 4 in the morning, and he had not gone alone. He had gone with the Ashby boy, the 15-year-old. The two of them, in conditions that Tom Bridle, who was not a man given to dramatic assessments, had described as the worst he'd seen on that range in a decade. And they had saved the herd. Not all of it. 2 had confirmed lost, a third found dead near the north tree line 2 days later when the snow settled enough to look. But 370-some cattle that should have been scattered across the frozen wilderness were penned or accounted for by morning. The town sat with this for a while. Ruth Hollenbach sat with it longer than most. She thought about the version of Lenora Ashby that had been assembled at her kitchen table over the past 6 weeks, the calculating widow, the woman with designs, and she put that version next to the image of a boy riding into a blizzard beside a man who hadn't asked for help from anyone in 3 years. She thought about what that cost a mother. She thought about what it meant that the boy had gone. She put on her coat on Saturday and drove out to the Cross Ranch herself. Not with Dora Finch, alone, in her own buggy, on roads that were passable now that the wind had stopped, though the snow was still piled high on either side of the track. Lenora answered the door. Ruth Hollenbach had spent 61 years forming opinions about people in the first 30 seconds of looking at them, and what she saw when the door opened was a woman who had not slept enough and was not going to mention it, wearing an apron over her good dress because the bread was in and she'd been checking it every 20 minutes. There were ink stains on her right hand from the ledger work. Her hair was practical, not pretty. She looked at Ruth Hollenbach with eyes that were waiting to find out what kind of visit this was going to be. "Mrs. Hollenbach," she said. Neutral, careful. "Mrs. Ashby." Ruth paused. "I came to see if you needed anything after the storm." Something shifted in Lenora's face, the careful neutrality giving way to something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the expression of a person who has been braced for one thing and received another. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "The coffee is fresh." Ruth came in and looked around the kitchen, the way people always did, but her inventory was different from Dora Finch's. She saw the organized shelves and the yellow curtain and the ledger book on the side table and the drawing of a fat gray cat that had been tacked to the wall near the window with a small nail. She saw a kitchen that was being lived in properly, with the particular care of someone who understood that a room could either drain you or sustain you depending on how you kept it. She sat down at the table. Maggie appeared from the back hallway, assessed the situation, and climbed onto the bench across from the visitor with Miller tucked under one arm. "That's a very large cat," Ruth said. "He's substantial," Maggie agreed seriously. Ruth Hollenbach, who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and run the social architecture of Blackbriar for 30 years, felt something loosen in her chest. She looked at the little girl and the oversized barn cat, and she thought, well. Lenora set down the coffee and sat across from her. They talked, at first, about practical things. The storm, the road conditions, the cattle losses, the state of Tom Bridle's horse. Ruth asked questions and Lenora answered them without embellishment, which Ruth found refreshing after years of conversations where everyone was performing something. Then Ruth said, without particular preamble, "I owe you something." Lenora looked at her. "Nora, I let things be said at my table that shouldn't have been said," Ruth told her, "about your intentions, about what you were here for." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I didn't say them myself, but I didn't stop them either. And at my age, I should know better than to call that neutrality." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "It's a small town," she said. "People talk. They do. And I'm the person who could have changed the direction of that talk and didn't." Ruth looked at her directly. "I'm sorry for that." It was the kind of apology that didn't leave room for comfortable deflection, which Ruth had intended. Lenora received it, looked at it, and nodded once, the same way Elias nodded when something had been said that he wasn't going to make a speech about. "Thank you," Lenora said. They drank their coffee. Maggie drew on a piece of paper she'd produced from somewhere, and Miller occupied the bench beside her with his eyes closed, and his expression one of deep personal satisfaction. When Ruth left 45 minutes later, she went back to town, and she did not hold a meeting, and she did not make an announcement. She simply, in the natural course of the following week's conversations, said what she'd seen, in the plain and specific language that people trust more than enthusiasm. The kitchen was clean, and the children were cared for, and the ledgers were in order, and the widow had looked her in the eye and taken an apology with more grace than Ruth would have managed in the same position. This did not end the talk entirely, because nothing ends talk entirely in a town that size. But it changed the character of it. It made the uglier version harder to hold with confidence. Back at the ranch, Gideon had been doing something that he hadn't done in a long time, which was thinking about the future. Not the ranch's future, that he'd always thought about, that was simply management. He was thinking about the future that existed in the house, the one that had been building all winter in the yellow curtain and the fixed pump seals and the drawings on the wall and the coffee that was always on and the sound of people breathing in the rooms he'd gotten used to being empty. He was thinking about what happened in April, because that was the arrangement. Through the winter. That was what she'd asked for and what he'd agreed to. He had not been a man who broke arrangements, which meant that when April came, or whenever the winter was considered officially done, she would pack the trunk with the broken latch and put Maggie and the drawings and the substantial cat into a wagon and drive back toward whatever came next, and the ranch would go back to being what it had been in November, which was functional and orderly and completely structurally silent. He rode out to the south fence on a Tuesday in late December to check a section that had been giving trouble and found himself stopped on a rise, looking back at the ranch buildings from maybe a mile out, and the thing he noticed was smoke from the kitchen chimney. Just smoke, rising straight up in the cold air because there was no wind that morning. But it meant the stove was going, which meant Lenora was in the kitchen, which meant the house was not empty, which meant there was a reason to look back at it. He sat on his horse in the cold and looked at the smoke for longer than he had any practical reason to. Then he rode on and checked the fence. The trouble was, and he understood this about himself without enjoying it, he was not good at the thing he needed to do next. He had never been particularly good at it. Clara had told him once that he communicated with people the way he communicated with the landscape. He expected them to tell him what they needed by showing it, because he didn't know how to ask, and found asking uncomfortable, and would always, given the choice, prefer to read the signs than name the weather out loud. It had not worked well in his marriage. He was aware that this was at least partly his fault. He had not known, at 32, how to be in a house with another person in the way that person needed him to be. He had known how to run a ranch. He had not known how to come home from running a ranch and leave it at the door. He wasn't sure he'd learned that yet. What he was sure of, and this certainty had arrived not in one moment but incrementally, in the way ground freezes, from the surface down, was that Lenora Ashby did not need what Claire had needed. She didn't need warmth poured over her like something that filled a shape. She needed something more like what the cattle needed in the worst cold: proximity, steadiness, and enough space to be what she was. He could do those things. He thought he could do those things. He was less sure than he wanted to be, which was itself a new feeling. He'd spent a long time being sure of himself, and having something to be less than sure about was disorienting in a way that he couldn't quite work out whether to trust. He said nothing about any of this for 2 more weeks, through Christmas, which came and went quietly on the ranch in a way that Lenora made something of despite having little to work with. She made a cake from the last of the sugar and some dried fruit, and she and Maggie had put pine branches on the mantel the week before. And there were small things she'd made or found: a carved wooden horse she'd discovered in the barn and cleaned up, a pair of mittens she'd knitted from leftover wool scraps. And on Christmas morning, there were gifts on the table for Elias and Maggie that hadn't required money, only attention to what a person needed or loved. Elias got a leather-bound field journal, blank pages, hardcover, from Lenora, for noting what he observed on the range. He'd been keeping observations on whatever scraps of paper he could find, and she'd noticed this without commenting on it for weeks. He opened it and sat with it for a moment. "You can use it for whatever you want," she said quickly, because she saw something in his face she wasn't sure how to read. "No," he said. "It's—" He stopped, tried again. "It's the right thing," he said. What Gideon put on the table that morning was less personal and more practical, which was exactly what everyone would have expected from him: a good quality folding knife for Elias and a set of proper drawing pencils for Maggie, still in their paper wrapper. Maggie received the pencils with an expression of profound reverence and immediately began testing each one in order of apparent darkness. Lenora looked at the pencils and the knife, and then at Gideon, who was pouring his own coffee and not looking at her. "You paid attention," she said. "I live in the same house," he said. "Not everybody notices." He brought his coffee to the table and sat down. "I notice things," he said. "I know you do," she said. They looked at each other across the table, over the coffee cups and the pencil wrappers and the field journal and the wooden horse that Maggie had already claimed as a companion for Miller, who was tolerating this with the dignity of an animal who has decided indifference is a form of power. Something was being said between them that neither of them was saying out loud. They both knew it. They both let it sit, because the timing was not yet right, and they were both, in their different ways, people who waited for timing. The new year came in cold, and by January's second week, the coldest stretch of the winter arrived, a 10-day period where the temperature didn't rise above 0 at its highest, where the work of keeping the ranch alive required everyone's full capacity and left nothing for anything else. They moved through those days with a focused efficiency that had become natural by now, each person knowing their part without needing to be told, the household running with the particular synchrony of people who have been in close quarters long enough to anticipate each other. Hatch's hands got frostbitten on the 5th day of the cold snap, and Lenora treated them, sitting with him at the kitchen table while he looked at the ceiling and made a sound he was trying to prevent from being anything too human, and she was patient with him and practical and didn't make him feel weak for what his hands were doing. He thanked her 3 times when it was done, which was 3 times more than Hatch typically said anything optional. Tom Bridle, who had been sleeping in the bunkhouse with his bad-footed horse taking the interior stall, came to the kitchen door one evening at the end of the cold snap and handed Lenora a piece of rope. Braided, careful, small enough to fit in a pocket, the kind of thing you could loop around a lost button to replace it. "For the coat," he said. "3rd button on yours is hanging." She looked at the rope braid in her hand. She looked at Tom Bridle, who had never said more than 12 consecutive words to her. "Thank you, Tom," she said. He said, and went back to the bunkhouse. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding the rope braid and thought about the shape of a person's goodwill, how it shows itself differently in different people, how you miss it if you're only looking for the form you already know. It was Carl who made the thing explicit, as Carl tended to do with most things, because Carl was constitutionally unable to leave observations inside himself for very long. He came in one afternoon in the third week of January for the folded supply list Lenore had left for him on the windowsill, and he picked it up and he stood there for a moment and he said, in the manner of someone making a general observation to the room at large, "You know, this place is different." Lenora was at the stove. Different how? Before, he gestured vaguely. He seemed to be genuinely searching for the word. It was like coming into somewhere that didn't want you here, even if nobody was saying it. You'd walk in to drop something off and there was just... He stopped. It's not like that now. Lenore didn't say anything. Anyway, Carl said, and picked up the supply list and went. She stood at the stove for a while after he left, thinking about what he'd said and whether she'd let herself feel the weight of it or keep holding it at arm's length the way she'd been holding most things since March, at the precise distance where they couldn't hurt her if they disappeared. The thing about distance, she was beginning to understand, was that it protected you from loss by guaranteeing it. You couldn't lose what you'd never let yourself have. It was the cleanest of bad deals. She'd taken the deal for 8 months because she'd had to, because you couldn't afford to pour yourself into something that was going to be pulled out from under you, because she had 2 children to keep fed and whole, and she did not have the luxury of falling apart over something that didn't work out. But she was tired. She was so tired of the careful distance. She was tired in the specific way that comes not from working hard, but from the effort of constantly withholding. She was thinking about this, still at the stove, the pot going, the light going amber in the windows toward late afternoon, when Gideon came in from the barn. He stomped the snow off his boots at the back door and hung his coat and hat on the hook and washed his hands and poured his coffee, all of it in the sequence she'd learned. And then he didn't leave. He stood at the counter with his coffee and the particular quality of stillness that meant he was working himself toward something. She waited. She knew the signs by now. "The arrangement," he said finally. She turned from the stove. "We said through the winter," he said. "We did." He looked at his coffee. He looked at the window, the yellow curtain, still there, the first thing that had changed. "Winter's not done." "No," she said, "it isn't. But it'll be done." He wasn't rushing it. He was laying it out the way he laid out a problem, clearly, without decoration. "And I'd like..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I've been trying to think about how to say this in a way that doesn't come out like a business proposal." Something moved in her chest. "But I'm not..." He made a short, frustrated gesture with his coffee hand. "I don't do this well. I didn't do it well the one time I tried, and I'm aware of that." "Gideon." He looked at her. "Say what you mean," she said. "I won't make anything of the way you say it." He held her eyes. Something in him settled. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not through the winter. Beyond it." A pause. "I'd like Elias to stay. Maggie." He put the coffee cup down because he needed his hands free, apparently, to get through the rest of it. "I know you didn't come here looking for this. I know you came here for a roof and work and a way through. I'm not..." He stopped again. "I'm not asking you to want something you don't want. I'm asking if what's built here over this winter is something you want to keep building." The kitchen was very quiet. The pot moved on the stove. Outside, the light was going down in the west, the way it went down in January, fast and cold and beautiful. Lenora looked at this man. She thought about everything she'd learned about him over 3 months. Not the version that came from the town, but the one she'd assembled herself from evidence. The 2 billionaires he hadn't known about, the knee he never mentioned, the way he'd handed Elias a cup of coffee in silence, and what that had meant. The pencils, still in their paper wrapper. The boots. The blue wool for curtains that kept the cold out of a room where her daughter slept. She thought about what she'd told herself this was, and what it had been quietly becoming. She thought about what it cost her to be wrong about something, and what it would cost her to be right about the wrong thing. "I have 2 children," she said, not as an objection, as a fact that he needed to be fully clear on. "I know that. They're not uncomplicated. Elias is 15 and he has opinions, and he misses his father, and he shows that in ways that are sometimes difficult." She held his gaze. "And Maggie is Maggie." The edge of his mouth moved. "I've noticed, Maggie. You'd be taking on all of it, not just the parts that are easy." "I'm aware," he said. I'm not under any illusion that this is going to be simple. A beat. Simple wasn't what I was asking for. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about April. She thought about another wagon, another road, another borrowed arrangement in another town that might be better or might be worse. She thought about Elias's rope-scarred hands and Maggie's drawing on the kitchen wall and the cat who had been a barn cat and was now, somehow, a house cat. And she thought about what Ruth Hollenbach had said and what Tom Bridle had communicated with a piece of braided rope. She thought about what it felt like to be in a place where people noticed the button on your coat. "I'd need it to be real," she said. Not harsh, not testing. Just the truth, plainly delivered, the only way she knew how to deliver anything. Not a longer version of a winter arrangement, something actual. "That's what I'm asking for," he said. "Something actual." She looked at the yellow curtain, at the drawing on the wall, at the coffee cup she'd put in front of Gideon Cross every morning for 3 months without once asking herself what she was building, because asking would have made it possible to lose. "All right," she said. Quiet. Certain. He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. He didn't say anything more because he'd said what he'd needed to say, and he wasn't a man who repeated himself. But he stayed in the kitchen. He stayed at the counter while she finished with the pot and set the table and called for the children, Elias from the barn, Maggie from wherever Maggie went in the late afternoon. And when they came in and the kitchen filled up with the noise and movement of a family settling around a table for dinner, Gideon Cross sat down at the head of it with the particular posture of a man who has made a decision and knows it is the right one, even knowing it will be hard, even knowing nothing about it will be simple. Elias came in last, pulling off his outer layers, and he stopped when he felt something different in the room. The way perceptive people stop when the atmosphere has changed and they're reading the change before they know what caused it. He looked at his mother, at Gideon, back at his mother. She met his eyes and gave him the smallest of nods. Just that. He stood there for a second. Then he went and hung up his coat and came and sat down at the table, and he was quiet through dinner. But it was the quiet of someone processing something large and not yet ready to name it, and that was all right. There would be time. There was, for the first time in a long time, something that resembled time. Maggie put Miller on the bench beside her in his usual position and told the table at length about a system she was developing for organizing her new pencils, which required more explanation than most organizational systems, but which she presented with the conviction of someone who has thought the matter through thoroughly. Nobody interrupted her. The fire burned, the curtains held the cold where it belonged, and around the table, 4 people, none of them simple, none of them without their damage, none of them certain of how the spring would look, ate dinner together in the house that was becoming, with the slow and stubborn persistence of things that are actually real, a home. February came in the way it always does in Wyoming, without apology, without any indication that it intended to be shorter than the months surrounding it, cold and flat and relentless in the particular way of a season that has been going on long enough that people have stopped remarking on it. The novelty of winter was gone. What remained was just the work of it, day after day, and the question of whether you were the kind of people who could endure the ordinary difficulty of a thing after the drama of it had passed. They were, it turned out, all 4 of them. The days settled into a rhythm that had the quality of something earned rather than something given. The 5 o'clock mornings, the cold that had to be fought back from every door and window, the animals that needed tending before anything else, the meals that appeared because someone made them appear, the accounts that balanced because someone kept them honest. None of it was romantic. All of it was real. And there's a kind of steadiness that grows in people who share the unglamorous work of keeping a life going, a trust that doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the accumulation of small, reliable ones. And that kind of trust was what the Cross Ranch had been quietly building since November. Gideon had not made any formal announcement to his ranch hands about the change in the arrangement, because he was not a man who made formal announcements. What he did instead was come into breakfast one morning in late January and sit down at the table in his usual chair and drink his coffee in the usual silence. And the only visible difference was that at the end of breakfast he looked at Elias and said, "The south fence section near the creek crossing. I'd like you to take the lead on that repair this week. Take Carl if you need a second pair of hands." Carl, who was present, looked at Elias. Elias looked at Gideon. "Yes, sir," he said. "You know what it needs?" Gideon asked. I looked at it last week. The post footings are heaved from the freeze. Needs to come out and be reset deeper, with gravel pack for drainage. A pause. That's right, Gideon said, in the tone of a man who already knew the answer and was satisfied with the one he'd received. He picked up his coffee and the conversation moved on. Carl told Tom about it that afternoon in the barn. Tom received this information the way Tom received most information, without visible reaction. Then he said, "Good," and went back to brushing down his horse's recovered leg, and that was the end of it. Hatch, when he heard, said nothing at all. But that evening, he spent an extra 20 minutes showing Elias a technique for tamping post gravel that would set faster in frozen ground, which was the Hatch equivalent of a formal endorsement. Elias did the fence repair over 3 days in the first week of February, and he did it right, and the section held through the rest of the winter without further complaint. He wrote the method and the measurements in the field journal his mother had given him for Christmas, in the careful, slightly cramped handwriting of someone who'd taught himself more than he'd been taught, and he noted the temperature and soil conditions because Gideon had mentioned once, in passing, that records were only useful if they were specific. He was doing this, building something that would outlast any single winter, assembling a body of knowledge about this land and what it needed, and he knew it. And the knowing sat in him as a quiet, serious thing that he hadn't yet found the right words for. He wasn't sure he needed to. What he needed words for was harder, and he circled it for most of February before he got there. He found Gideon alone in the tack room on a Saturday afternoon, the particular kind of alone that men choose when they need to do a task that doesn't require thinking about, because they are thinking about something else. Gideon was oiling a bridle that did not particularly need oiling. Elias stood in the doorway. "Can I talk to you?" Gideon looked up. "Go ahead." Elias came in and stood with his back to the wall in the manner of someone who needs the support of something solid behind them. He was quiet for a moment, assembling it. "I want you to know," he said finally, "that I understand what you said to my mother, what you asked." He paused. "She told me. Not everything, but enough." Gideon set the bridle down. "I'm not—" Elias stopped, started over. "I'm not going to make it difficult. I don't want to make it difficult." He looked at the floor for a second, then back up. "My father was a good man. He worked hard and he was fair and he loved us the best way he knew how. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen, and I'm not going to pretend you're him. That wouldn't be right for either of us." The tack room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the roof in its customary way. "But I've watched you," Elias continued, "since November. I've watched how you run this place and how you treat the animals and how you've treated us. And—" He was 15 and the emotion was right there, just under the surface of the even voice. And he was working to keep it from coming through in a way he'd regret. "I think you're a person worth trusting, and I don't think that about very many people. I haven't for a while." Gideon looked at this boy. This 15-year-old with rope-scarred hands and a field journal full of careful observations and his dead father's eyes. He thought about what it cost someone that age to say something that honest to someone they didn't entirely know yet. He thought about what it had taken him until his late 30s to learn, and what this boy already carried. "Your father taught you well," Gideon said. "He did." Elias swallowed. "I just wanted you to know where I stand." Gideon picked the bridle back up, not because it needed attention, but because it gave both of them somewhere to look that wasn't at each other. "I appreciate that," he said. "I want you to know where I stand too." He worked the leather in his hands. "I'm not going to tell you what to call me or how to think about what this is. That's yours to work out. All I can tell you is that I'll be straight with you and I'll keep my word and I won't ask you to be anything other than what you are." He paused. "That's all I've got." Elias nodded. "That's enough," he said. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No one cried. Nothing was resolved in any permanent or absolute sense. Elias went back to the barn and Gideon went back to the bridle that didn't need oiling, and the afternoon moved on. The way. Afternoons do when the most important things happen in the space of 10 minutes and then ordinary time resumes. But something had been established, a line of foundation, invisible and load-bearing. March arrived and the cold began grudgingly to release its hold. Not all at once. Nothing in Wyoming relinquished anything all at once. But in degrees. The temperature rose above zero by midday for the first time in weeks. The light changed. It was subtle at first. The kind of thing you notice in your body before you could articulate it, a slight easing, a sense of something turning that had been pointed in the wrong direction for a long time. Lenora noticed it first, the way she noticed most things, practically without ceremony. She started seeds indoors in late February, in small wooden boxes lined up along the south-facing kitchen window where they'd get the most of the strengthening light. Tomatoes, squash, onion sets. Gideon had mentioned a kitchen garden the previous fall had gone unplanted, and she'd filed this away and done nothing with it until now, when now felt like the right time. She didn't ask him about it. She just started the seeds. He noticed them on the windowsill about 3 days in. He stood and looked at them for a moment in the morning with his coffee, the way he had looked at the yellow curtain the first time, taking inventory, recalibrating. "Kitchen garden?" he said. "If that's all right. There's a fenced section south of the house. Clara put it in years ago, never got used." He drank his coffee. "I'll have Carl clear the dead growth out." "I can do it." "Carl will do it," he said, in the tone that meant the matter was settled, and moved on. Carl cleared the garden section on a Tuesday, grumbling companionably to himself, and by Wednesday Maggie had appointed herself the supervisor of the operation and was providing Carl with detailed instructions on where the tomatoes should go based on a system that made internal sense to her but which Carl could not entirely follow. He implemented it anyway because Maggie had a way of presenting her positions that made disagreement feel like more trouble than it was worth. The town's relationship to all of this had been shifting since January, in the way that community opinion shifts, not with the dramatic reversal of a single moment, but through the patient accumulation of evidence that the version people had been holding didn't match the actual thing. Ruth Hollenbach had been consistent. Dora Finch had been less vocal than she'd been in November and December. Even Vernon Crail, who had come out in December with his careful warnings, had stopped by the ranch in late January on legitimate business. A fence line question, a shared survey marker they'd been meaning to settle for 2 years, and had come inside for coffee and had sat at the kitchen table while Maggie showed him her pencil organization system and had left 40 minutes later looking like a man who'd been expecting to find one thing and found another. He didn't apologize the way Ruth had. That wasn't Vernon's way. But he didn't say another word against the arrangement, and in Blackbriar, silence from Vernon Crail was approximately equivalent to a formal endorsement from anyone else. There was a day in the middle of March, a Saturday, the kind of early spring Saturday where the temperature broke 40 degrees for the first time, and everyone on the ranch felt it in their shoulders, a physical release of the bracing posture that winter required, when a handful of people from town came out to the ranch. Not a delegation, not organized. Ruth Hollenbach came because she'd been intending to for weeks. Carl's wife came because she'd been hearing about this household for months and wanted to see it for herself. A couple of the neighboring families stopped in on their way back from errands in town because Ruth had mentioned she was going, and the road went past the ranch gate anyway. What they found was not a performance. That was the thing that Lenora had not arranged, and which she couldn't have arranged if she'd tried because performances require preparation, and she'd had no warning. What they found was the ranch in the middle of its Saturday, Gideon in the yard talking to Tom about the cattle rotation for the coming month, Elias on the south fence with the look of a boy who has made himself expert at something and knows it, Maggie in the kitchen garden area with Carl, who was listening to her with patient incomprehension while she explained her planting logic, Lenora in the kitchen with the bread in and the ledger open, and her hair not quite right because she'd been outside checking the seed boxes in the wind. Ruth Hollenbach stood in the yard and looked at all of this, the working ranch, the family moving through it, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for months. Gideon noticed the visitors and did what he always did with people on his property. He went and acknowledged them directly, without warmth, but without coldness either. He shook hands. He showed Vernon's wife the North Range, which she'd heard about from her husband. He answered questions about the herd loss in December with the specificity of someone who has made his peace with a hard thing by understanding it completely. Lenora fed everyone because that was what you did, and there was enough because there was almost always enough in a kitchen she was running, not out of abundance, but out of the habit of making things extend. The kitchen held more people than it had been designed for, and nobody minded. At some point in the afternoon, Dora Finch found herself standing next to Lenora in the kitchen, while Lenora sliced bread that had just come out and was still warm, and the silence between them had the particular weight of things unsaid. Dora was not a naturally humble person, she'd be the first to admit it, But she was not dishonest either, which is sometimes a better quality. I said some things, Dora said without preamble. In the fall, about you. Lenora kept slicing. I know. I don't... Dora stopped. I wasn't being malicious. I want you to know that. I was being... She seemed to search for the word. Afraid, I think, of something changing, of what it meant if... She shook her head. It doesn't matter. The point is I was wrong, and I said it loudly enough that I should probably say this loudly too. Lenora set the knife down. She looked at Dora, this woman who had come to the ranch in December with her careful eyes and her prepared opinion and her unfortunate talent for giving shape to what other people were only thinking. I know you weren't being malicious, Lenora said. I've dealt with malicious. That's different. She paused. People make up their minds when they don't have information. I'd probably do the same. She picked up the bread and put it on the table. We can start from here. Dora looked at her. She nodded once, quickly, in the manner of someone receiving a grace they hadn't expected to be offered. Thank you, she said. Don't make me regret it, Lenora said, without heat. Dora laughed, a surprised, genuine sound, and that was where the afternoon tipped into something easier, something that moved through the kitchen with the bread and the coffee and spilled out into the yard where Gideon was explaining fence line decisions to a man who hadn't come to talk about fence lines but found himself genuinely interested. Elias came in late in the afternoon from the fence work, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway at the sight of the room full of people. And there was a moment, just a flicker, of the old wariness, the body memory of what it felt like to walk into rooms where you were being talked about. He was 15, and he had 8 months of road behind him, and those things leave marks. Then Maggie appeared from somewhere and grabbed his sleeve and said, Elias, come look at the garden. I showed Carl where everything goes. And he let himself be pulled forward into the afternoon, into the room full of people who were, it turned out, just people. The gathering broke up in the early evening when the temperature started dropping again. It always dropped again. That was still weeks away from changing, and people made their way back to their wagons and their own homes. Ruth Hollenbach was the last to leave, as she often was, not because she overstayed, but because she had the quality of presence that made people want to keep talking to her. She stood with Lenora at the door. You built something here, Ruth said. We did, Lenora said, not falsely modest, not overstating it. All of us. Blackbriar is better with your family in it, Ruth said. I know that's not nothing, coming from me. Lenora looked at the older woman. She thought about November, the borrowed wagon, the cracked wheel rim, the $11, the careful assessment of whether this man at this fence would be the one who finally said yes. She thought about what she'd been asking for that first day. Just a chance, just the next thing, just a door that opened instead of closed. It's not nothing, she said. Thank you, Ruth. Ruth patted her hand once, briskly, and went to her buggy. April came the way April comes to Wyoming, tentatively, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, a warm day followed by a cold one, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first and holding in the shadows in the low places. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property unfroze from the banks inward and moved fast with snowmelt, and the sound of it could be heard from the barn in the mornings, which was the sound of winter ending. The cattle had come through well. The losses from December had been the worst of it, 3 head total, and the rest of the herd had wintered with fewer casualties than the previous year, which Gideon attributed to the earlier feed rotation and the adjusted shelter use in the North Range, both of which had been implemented based on observations Elias had made and recorded in the field journal and mentioned almost in passing at breakfast one morning in early January. Gideon had looked at the journal entries, had not said much, had changed the rotation schedule 2 days later. He did not make a production of this. Elias noticed and said nothing about it, which Gideon appreciated. What Gideon did make a production of, or what passed for a production in his particular register, was a morning in the first week of April when he came in from the barn before the others were up and sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen and spent 20 minutes writing something. He was not a man who wrote things down easily. The pen sat in his hand with the specific discomfort of a tool that didn't belong there. But he finished it, eventually, and folded it, and when Lenora came into the kitchen, he slid it across the table to her. She looked at it, at him. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was not elegant. The handwriting was functional at best, and the sentences were short because he'd run out of ways to extend them. What it said, in plain language, was that he was proposing a legal partnership in the ranch, in the household, in the life, and that he understood she might need time to think about it, and he would not press for an answer faster than she could honestly give one. He had included one line at the bottom, separate from the rest, that read, "This is not something I am asking for because it makes sense. It makes sense, but that's not why." She read it twice. She put it down on the table. He was looking at his coffee cup. "You wrote this out," she said. "I say it wrong when I don't." She looked at the letter again. The functional handwriting, the short sentences, the one line at the bottom that was the most honest thing on the page because it didn't try to be more than it was. She thought about what she'd said to him in January. "I'd need it to be real." And she thought about everything since January. The seeds on the windowsill, the fence Elias had repaired, the afternoon of people in the kitchen, Dora Finch's imperfect apology, Tom's braided rope, Maggie's garden plan, the field journal accumulating pages. She thought about what real looked like when it wasn't announced, when it just grew into the available space. "I don't need time," she said. He looked up. "I've had 4 months," she said. "I don't need more time to know what I know." She folded the letter back along its creases. She kept it. She would keep it. She already knew. She would put it in the trunk that now had a new latch that Elias had fixed in January. "Yes," she said. "To all of it." He didn't say anything right away. He picked up his coffee, which was a gesture that stood in for everything he didn't have the language to deliver cleanly. Then he said, "I'll go to town this week, talk to the judge." "All right," she said. She went to the stove because the bread needed checking, and he sat at the table, and the morning moved on in its ordinary way, and neither of them performed anything for the other because there was nobody to perform for, and because the truest things rarely require an audience. Elias found out the way he found out most things now, not through being told, but through being present. He saw the letter in his mother's hand before she put it away. He saw the quality of the morning. He was 16 in 3 weeks, old enough to read a room, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and took the measure of what was in front of him. Then he went and poured himself coffee, which was something Gideon had started letting him do without comment sometime in February, and he sat down at the table and said, "Carl's going to need help with the East Gate hinge today. I told him I'd get to it this morning." "Take the good wrench," Gideon said. "The hinge is metric. The other one won't fit." "I know," Elias said. "It's yet." Maggie found out differently, because Maggie found out everything differently. Lenora sat down with her that evening before bed, while Miller was going through his elaborate pre-sleep arrangement on the foot of the bed, and she explained it in the plain and honest language she'd always used with her daughter, not simplifying, not dramatizing. She explained what the decision meant and what it didn't mean, and what would change and what wouldn't. Maggie listened with her arms wrapped around her knees in the seriousness of a person who is processing something large. "Does Gideon want us to stay?" she asked. "He asked us to." A pause. "Did he ask about Miller?" Lenora looked at the cat who had achieved his preferred sleeping configuration and was now a gray monument to personal comfort. "I think Miller was assumed," she said. Maggie nodded slowly, the particular nod of a child arriving at a considered position. "Okay," she said. "Okay? It's good here," Maggie said, in the simple declarative way she said most things that were in fact complicated. It was scary for a long time, being on the road. She unclasped her arms and lay down next to Miller, who endured this with characteristic dignity. "I don't want to be scared like that again." Lenora sat on the edge of the bed for a while after Maggie's eyes closed. She thought about what her daughter had just said. Scared like that. She thought about how long they'd been on the road and how much her children had absorbed without complaint, without being asked to. She thought about what it means to protect your children and how sometimes you can only know after the fact which of the things you did actually worked. She looked at the blue wool curtains, the ones she'd sewn herself, that kept the cold out of this room where her daughter slept, and she thought, we made it, all 3 of us. We came through. The spring continued its cautious advance through the rest of April and into May, and the ranch woke up from winter the way it did every year, not all at once, but with a gathering momentum that eventually became undeniable. Calving season came and brought its chaos and its losses and its small victories. The kitchen garden that Maggie had planned with such architectural conviction actually grew, which surprised Carl, who had quietly doubted the planting grid but kept this to himself. "Tomatoes by July," Lenora told him. He made a skeptical sound that was his way of saying he'd believe it when he saw it, and he was beginning to think he might see it. Gideon and Lenora were married on a Saturday in early May by the county judge in the front room of the ranch house with Elias and Maggie and Tom Bridle and Carl's wife and Hatch and Ruth Hollenbach present. Ruth had brought flowers, early wildflowers from the south-facing slope where the snow had retreated furthest, and she'd put them in a jar on the mantel without making a ceremony of it. It was not a long ceremony. The judge was efficient, and Gideon was uncomfortable with length. Lenora wore the dress she'd kept in the trunk since before Cheyenne, the one she'd been saving without letting herself say what she was saving it for. It still fit, mostly. The hem needed 2 inches, but she hadn't had time, so she'd let it be. Elias stood beside his mother. He was steady all the way through, right up until the very end, when the judge said the words that made it official, and Gideon took Lenora's hand in that particular deliberate way of his, and then Elias had to look at the ceiling for a moment. He looked at the ceiling and breathed, and then he was fine. After Carl opened the bottle he'd brought, and Tom gave his glass a suspicious look before drinking from it, and Maggie showed Ruth Hollenbach the garden plan drawn in her best pencil on a piece of paper that she'd been carrying in her pocket all day, in case anyone wanted to see it. Vernon Crail sent a note. He didn't come himself. That was still a step too far for Vernon, and everyone understood that, but the note was genuine, which counted for something. The ranch that had been a fortress in November was, by May, something else. Not perfect. Nothing worth having is perfect. The east gate hinge that Elias had fixed in April needed attention again. The water line to the horse barn remained a winter worry. Gideon's knees were what they were. Elias had bad days when the grief of his father moved through him unexpectedly, and those days were hard. And the only thing that helped was time and the particular patience that Gideon had developed for not pressing where pressing would do damage. Lenora still woke sometimes in the early mornings from the body memory of lying in a cold wagon, listening for sounds she didn't want to hear, and it took her a few minutes to come back from that place. These things were true. They remain true. They would probably always be true in some form. People don't outrun what they've carried. They learn to carry it differently, in smaller amounts, with better help. What was also true, what was equally real, equally earned, was the ranch in the early morning in May, when the light came across the prairie flat and gold and the creek was running clear and the cattle were moving in the east pasture and the kitchen had smoke coming from the chimney because someone was in there making coffee, and somewhere in the garden Maggie was having a conversation with Miller about horticultural philosophy, and Elias was at the fence with the field journal open in his left hand and a pen in his right, writing down what he saw. And Gideon Cross was standing at the barn door in the early light, looking at all of this, his land, his people, his unlikely and specific and irreplaceable life. And he was not a man given to gratitude as a feeling he could name, but he knew the shape of it. He'd learned it over one long winter, in the way real things get learned. Not from a single moment, but from every small accumulation of evidence that something is true. A widow had walked up to his fence in November with nothing but honesty and the nerve to use it, and he had opened the gate, and everything after that had been the consequence of that one unglamorous decision made by 2 tired and imperfect people who had both, at the same moment, chosen forward over safe. That was the whole story. That was all it was. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.